but he flipped, right? No longer London embassy was the most important embassy for Brazil in the world. It was Washington's embassy, right? It became this push to actually deepen relations with the United States. And why am I highlighting all this? Because at that time, Brazilian elites saw the rise of the United States not as much as a threat, right? At their own risk, I would say, right? Not as much as a threat as some other countries in Latin America perceived at the time. So Brazilian was a allied country, right, in the World War II effort. There were even conversations that Brazil maybe. I mean, there was a little bit of a promise. There's a little bit of a debate about that. But at least in the eyes of Brazilian political economic elites, that Brazil, because of it, had supported so much the United States in the ally effort in World War II. And it was now speaking for the region that it maybe should have a seat at the United Nations Security Council.
Wow.
Yes, yeah, I know. That leads us, and which is a very important new chapter in U.S.-Brazil relations, which is a military coup in 1964. And that puts into the country a long-lasting 21 years old, or you could even go beyond that, a long dictatorship. It's a very repressive regime. It's a right-wing, reactionary, conservative military regime, or new regime in power, which was supported by the United States government. President Johnson supports the coup, approves the coup, condones the coup. Hey, we believe that we are, or we could be, and you should help us become a tropical version of the United States. But you don't see that. So that's where a little bit of a sense of being misunderstood, or not being valued enough, or not being understood enough, and in that sense, not being supported and even disrespected in that, right? Well, our ambition is just to be like you. But again, I need to nuance that. But not at the cost of losing who we are, right?
Dr. Otis, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Before we discuss the history of U.S.-Brazil relations, the purpose of our interview, the reason why I invited you to our program, I want to speak with you about the Brazilian people. Well, please tell us, how do Brazilians perceive the United States?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to share some of these ideas that, of course, I think could be very helpful, I hope, right? To foster higher levels of understanding, which is kind of my quest, right? In academia, as a Brazilian teaching the United States about Brazil, so I'm always eager to be able to share ideas on this.
Wonderful.
The overview, the overall view of the Brazilians about the United States, or the image of the United States in Brazil, I would say. Of course, it varies according to specific moments in time, but also depending on specific topics. But overall, it's very positive. It's interesting.
Very positive. Okay.
Perhaps, I'm not sure. It depends on the time and place, but there is a little bit of a sense that maybe U.S. and American relations, and I agree with that sense, have not historically been the best, or could have been better in many different moments in history. So maybe some may assume, and that's to some extent even true in Brazil, and there's sometimes basis for that, right? That there's a sort of a gringo image, right, of the United States as an imperialist force, and again, there's something there, and again, heightened in some moments vis-a-vis others. But overall, again, to the main point, right? It's very positive. It's a country that Brazilians admire, for the most part. Think it's a country that did a lot of things right, became an economic powerhouse, became an important country in the world, also coming from a shared experience of being colonized, right, and overcoming that reality. So there's a deep sort of appeal by U.S. pop culture in Brazil. I don't think it's only in Brazil, but very heightened in Brazil. Brazilians love to visit the United States, see Miami, LA, New York, the big obvious cities as places of destination. Of course, it restricted to being able to afford those trips, but more and more. Middle classes, have been to New York several times. They like the culture, they like the pop culture, the musical industry. So it's overall a very positive image. Of course, we can nuance that in different issues and moments.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's just address a couple of nuanced points. both to learn and also for a bit of fun. You mentioned pop culture a couple of times, so I think I know the answer to the question I'm about to ask. Like, do they watch our movies, our Netflix series, and all of that? Like, going back into the 80s, would they watch our series, the Dallas, series and stuff like that? Like, Who Shot JR, that sort of thing,
Very much. So I grew up in Brazil, and there are maybe 4 or 5, traditional channels. Now, of course, with cable TV and everything else, a lot of that has changed. But again, growing up a long time ago, 4 or 5 channels, and all of them would show at least once, if not twice, a U.S. Hollywood movie on TV, or sometimes series, many different series every night on prime time. You would watch usually, sort of with the Brazilian, it's spoken in Portuguese, right?
Yeah, it's dubbed.
Not often with subtitles, more often dubbed. Important companies, do that kind of work in Brazil, have done that, and very popular. So, I mean, the sense in Brazil is that they very much understood the U.S. Culture.
I love it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's no, there's no pushback, such as, let's say, in China or sometimes even in France, that the U.S. Hollywood culture is dominating Brazil's own culture. There's none of that, based on what you say.
I would say mostly no. Of course, sometimes some specific groups of people, like like movie producers in Brazil, Brazilian movie producers, artists. Sometimes they complain, well, we should not restrict U.S. movies, but we should at least favoring, find ways that people watch more Brazilian movies, or listen more to Brazilian music.
Which makes sense.
More in the movies than in the music, but the Brazilians love Brazilian music as well as U.S. music.
Yeah. How about in the news? Are we in Brazilian news often? Do we have a larger presence in Brazilian news than Brazil does in our news?
Very much so. Yes. So recently, I just finally put in my house here in Denver access to one of the main channels from Brazil that broadcasts internationally. And I started again watching sometimes some of the nightly news from Brazil, and I was reminded once again that how much the things in the United States are. The perception in Brazil is that as much. That's probably not true, but we know as much about the United States than a U.S. person would have, in the sense that every night you'd have segments on different things, mostly about politics of the United States, but sometimes there's some uniqueness. Of course, like a flood in Texas or something like that. It would be highly, broadcasted in Brazil. So there's a big deep sense that we almost we are aware of what's going on, and that's not nearly reciprocal, right?
Of course. And to be sure, when you say that America has a presence in Brazilian news, America's presence is larger than, let's say, the presence of Mexico in Brazilian news, or presence of the United Kingdom in Brazilian news, any other country, right?
I would say yes. If you were to pick one country, that would be the U.S. Europe has historically have an important influence, cultural, artistic, in Brazil, in Latin America more broadly, and it's still relevant. Again, as I said, Brazilian middle classes love to visit the United States. They also love to visit, I would say, probably France, UK, and then maybe a few other countries in Europe, Italy. So yes, there's news about European affairs too, but more so the one country that is more kind of shared in terms of the things about that country that are shared on a daily basis in Brazil would be the United States.
Yeah. Is there are there any particular, I'm not talking politics, just sort of particular social or cultural sensitivities towards the U.S. and Brazil? For example, I remember this history from the 1990s when, or late 1990s, when Jurassic Park came out and it dominated all the French theaters, and a movie came out in France about the history of France, and there was all this sensitivity in France that, my gosh, we got to have equal number of theaters showing a movie about the history of France. So that was not a political thing. That was more like a social sensitivity, cultural sensitivity. Is there such a thing, similar sort of concept in Brazil?
That's interesting. Again, I would say that there have been moments when specific, especially like movie industry in Brazil, has acted and sometimes have obtained not protections or protectionism, but sort of subsidies or incentives to be able to find specific places where Brazilian movies would be displayed. Interestingly, I'm not sure how much that actually reflected a popular demand. That would be much more specific segments of like cultural production that demanded that, and some specific sectors of the government that attended or did not attend those kind of demands. If you would ask the regular guy in the street, do you fear the United States culture is too much shared in Brazil? I would be highly doubtful that would be the answer.
Interesting.
Yeah, of course, it depends. Again, it's hard to generalize a country of over 200 million people.
Of course.
Brazilians are very, very proud of their cultural expressions, of their culture, of their sense of a nationhood. They're very nationalistic people as well. But again, the United States, because of this very overwhelming positive image, again, there are issues we can discuss. But they would say, well, like, hey, I can still listen to my samba, just to mention one important Brazilian.
I love it, of course, yeah.
Expression, right? But it's fine. I also love rock and roll. They're very much aware of who the main pop artists in the United States on a specific moment are. They would sing a lot of, sometimes they sing maybe not even aware of exactly what they're saying sometimes, but they would try to sing in English or a broken English. Yeah. So that's very, very much a part of a general, daily cultural, expressions of people. Again, there's also, if I may sort of come back to one of the things, like the overwhelming image of the United States and Brazil, I would say there's also a general sense that there's a lot we have in common, right? I would say that way more from Brazil than from the U.S. And that I think this could be something we could, focus throughout the conversation.
Yeah.
But there's a huge sense in Brazil that, hey, we are very much like you. We're also a large country. We are also a real melting pot. We are a country that, our nation is this combination of different groups of people coming together. We are a vibrant country in terms of cultural expressions, music, art. We celebrate life. You guys, at least in pop culture, you celebrate life. It's an alive culture.
Yeah.
We have so much in common. Why don't you see that? Right?
Why don't you see that?
There's a lot of that sense, right? Why don't you see that? In a way, if I were to, again, all of these things are little, always a simplification. But if I was to put it in one sentence, would be maybe a way to phrase that sense is, hey, we believe that we are, or we could be, and you should help us become a tropical version of the United States. But you don't see that. So there's where a little bit of a sense of being misunderstood, or not being valued enough, or not being understood enough, and in that sense not being supported and even slashing disrespected in that, right? Well, our ambition is just to be like you, but again, I need to nuance that, but not at the cost of losing who we are, right? We're proud of being Brazilians. We love our stuff, and we just like to maybe merge, a lot more of you, but also let's do it in a reciprocal way, right? Why don't you know more about us? Why not as interested in us as we are in you? So a little bit of those elements, I would say, it also should be brought to the conversation in the sense that, yes, overwhelmingly a positive sense, but a little bit of that sense of, why don't you know more about us? Why don't you want to know more about us? Why do you have this sort of sense that we're less than you? All we want is just to become more like you in a way. Again, I will stop there because otherwise I generalize and simplify too much.
That is fascinating. Is that something that discussed in politics, or is it something that's discussed amongst people from time to time?
It has impacted historically specific political, diplomatic, economic projects, policies, approaches, initiatives, right? And have helped shape the relation between the United States and Brazil from an official sense. But I think it goes beyond that. It's again, that kind of difference between the official position, diplomatic position, right, or economic, political initiatives in a general sense of the population. And of course, again, let me just nuance one more thing. There are segments of the population in Brazil that have much more kind of a traditional view of the Yankee imperialism, and in some specific moments they have been heightened. We can come back to some of those. But again, overall, there's this positive sense, but with a little bit of a hint of frustration. Why aren't you as interested in us as we are in you?
Yeah. I get that. You mentioned, I love this phrase, tropical version of the U.S., which brings me to this question. Did Brazilian or do Brazilians ever get frustrated saying, Americans, and I'm not talking so much about the government, just American organizations, environmental organizations, or individuals, wealthy, well-off individuals interested in the environment. You guys are supporting the rainforest. I remember this in the early 2000s. I knew people that were buying rainforest land and just essentially preserving it. In America, they were doing that in Brazil. So is there ever local political resentment, pushback in the rural community and farmers saying, hey, this is Brazil, stop doing this, interfering with that aspect? Again, I'm not talking about relations between governments. I'm just saying on the environmental front.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to get into that from what we discussed before.
Yeah.
I think we can see some of the elements of what I just mentioned here as well. The Amazon, again, a big part of Brazil's territory, right? Half of Brazil's territory is sort of situated in this broad region of the Amazon, which in itself, I would say it's a universe. Amazon is not it's a homogeneous, region. There's a lot of different, ecosystems within that. But nonetheless, right? The Amazon reality, the Amazonia, right? Amazonia is a big part of Brazil. It goes beyond Brazil, but it's a big part of Brazilian territory. Brazilians have had Brazilians themselves have had, or ourselves, I should say, had a weird relationship with the Amazon. There's a sense of pride. Did
you say weird relationship?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Let me try to explain why.
Sure.
There's a sense of pride. There's a sense of, it's wonderful that we have it here because it's this fantastic, universe. In the past, from the 19th century, not as we see today as an ecological resource, rich, much more as a sense, maybe a region to be exploited, right? There's a lot of potential. There's a lot of riches there, but mixed with a little bit of a sense of mysteriousness, fear. This is really the boonies, the jungles. And again, Brazilian colonization started on the coast, and to this day, majority of Brazilians live within 100, 200 miles of the coast. There's a long coast on the Atlantic. And close to maybe 75-80% of the population live within 200 miles of that coast. So there's this huge interior, not only the Amazon, there's also this sort of savanna in the center of the country, which is not as populated as much of the coastal regions. So there's a bit of a historical sense of huge potential and all of that, but also we don't really understand it very well. It's a little mysterious, and mysteriousness could lead to sense of wonder and greatness, but also a little bit of a fear. Also, there's a lot of prejudice of the inhabitants of that, not only indigenous populations, which is a significant part of people who still live there, but also this mixed race indigenous with the children of the Portuguese colonizers and Afro people from Africa brought into slavery into Brazil. So it's kind of the mixed race Brazilians in the countryside, in the interior, into the Amazon. A little bit of that also seen as inferior, portion of the country. So that has been sort of the overwhelming sense.
By inferior portion of the country, you mean racially inferior?
Yeah, there's just a little sense of, they're not as white or as educated or as civilized or as prosperous as we are in that sense. Okay. Right? From a white middle class sense of, from the coastal populations of Brazil. Yeah. But Amazonia has also been an important focus of appeal that Brazil has projected into the world, including into the United States and including all the way into the 19th century. There was a pressure from the United States, private actors and government to kind of open the Amazon River to international navigation because they also saw this huge potential of what was there. Again, it was a big question mark. What is there? But we believe there's a lot there, right? So we should have access to that river. And there was, diplomatic, not conflicts, but diplomatic negotiations and discussions with that, right? And I brought that up because that has been also a recurrent element of a little bit of a sense of nationalism, right? Sometimes by including military dictatorships in Brazil, who, military regimes have been, more than ever should have been the case, a reality in Brazilian politics. And they have sort of protected, in a very nationalistic, protective, sense, like, hey, now we understand your interest in the Amazon, but it's ours, right? We'll take care of it. We're the ones that need to decide, how to exploit it and so forth. So that has been a kind of different elements of how the Amazonia has been seen in Brazil, but also how Brazilian authorities, Brazilians have projected, this reality of having the Amazon as part of Brazil to the world. So there was a little bit of that sense of pride, but also more so in the sense that we are the ones that are going to decide to do this. That has changed somewhat, I would say, in the last 30, 40 years with the growing environmental awareness global, but also in Brazil, even in Brazil, right? Where you would see sometimes people on the left, and I would say sometimes even during dictatorship, which primarily took place in the 1960s, 70s into the 80s in Brazil, where some people on the left would say, yes, we need to protect the Amazon, but the way that the military regime wants to protect or to take care of it is actually by protecting the borders, yes, but then to give concessions to even multinational corporations to come and exploit it. And that's not really the kind of protection we see it, right? Protection in our view is protecting the people of the Amazon, right? We need to actually have developmental projects that benefit the peoples of the Amazon more fully than has been the case. And I think today that is still an element that more progressive groups in Brazil espouse. But they added to that also the environmental awareness, right? The environmental consciousness. Chico Mendes was a very, very important environmentalist in Brazil in the 1980s, worldly known. It was better known in the world than in Brazil, by the way, by traditional Brazilian middle classes. Public opinion, I would call, right? Knew him less than the kind of, environmental groups abroad. And he was killed. He was murdered because he was trying to protect the Amazon.
He was murdered in Brazil?
It was mostly in Brazil by big landowners. So that's another segment, right? Yeah. So big, powerful landowners, interest and capital, mining corporations from Brazil and from abroad have now kind of reversed a little bit of that, right? In the sense that not necessarily protect or it's ours, but that we go back to that idea of it's a huge, area to be exploited. There's tremendous wealth there and we need to exploit. And now, and the current government there, which is a center-left government under Lula, as he did in the early 2000s, are the ones kind of saying a little bit of that idea that we are the caretakers of the Amazon. So it's up to us to decide how to deal with it. But a big element of it is actually taking care of reducing deforestation, but also trying to give more voices to indigenous peoples or poor, social segments of the Amazon. And I think that's something that today we see more on that. So there's always a little bit of a different groups and interest in how they talk about the Amazon. But now we come back to that idea where the situation where progressive groups are the one more now voicing environmental concerns. Interestingly, not at the exclusion of international actors. Let me give a concrete example. Environmental groups from the 1980s, such as the time of Chico Mendes, and especially more recently, the last 30, 40 years, but also indigenous groups have been extremely able and savvy in establishing sort of solidarity, right, networks with environmental groups abroad, internationally, including in the United States, right? Indigenous groups in Brazil now are much more in contact with indigenous groups in the United States and abroad as well, about, protecting the Amazon, protecting themselves, protecting their rights, voicing their views about the Amazon. And especially in the last government in Brazil, which was under Jair Bolsonaro, who was the president until early 2023, he was really, interestingly, a former military man and really supported by the armed forces in Brazil, but a right-wing, I would say extreme right-wing government, that tried to hearken a little bit of that idea of protecting the Amazon. The Amazon is ours, but not really, because he was really opening with a lot of concessions to multinational mining corporations and really allowing landowners to speed up the deforestation process. And it was exactly indigenous groups and environmental groups that resisted, including by appealing to international networks of solidarity, voicing their views, and social media played an important role. Indigenous groups would record, deforestation or sometimes attacks, like murders, genocidal actions from landowners and police supported by the government against their lands, against their peoples, against their rights, and they would broadcast that through social networks abroad and voice that into international sort of means to demand, to say, look what's happening in Brazil, and so that has been a sort of a new chapter of that relation with the. That's why it's hard to say the United States and Brazil, because it depends who in the United States and who in Brazil, right?
Exactly. Versus what administration, what agencies, what NGOs, and what have you. It's really interesting. So let me just go back to share my own take and tell me if I'm wrong on this. So we go back to the 19th century and the early 1900s, in which let's say the U.S. and the West are pushing for opening up the Amazon River to international navigation, and basically Brazil says, no way, the Mississippi is not open to international navigation. We're not going to open it up. So that's there. So nationalism. The second question is, okay, now that we're keeping the Amazon River and the Amazon area for ourselves, how do we protect it? What does that mean? Do we protect it? Does that protection mean exploiting it for our national economic, financial interests, maybe some oligarchs, maybe some real national economic benefit, or do we protect the people and the environment? So that fight is there. I get it. In addition to going back to the phrase that you used, tropical version of the U.S., why don't you support us? You said this also impacts historical relations between the U.S. and that perception. So it's sort of a slight undercurrent in that long relationship. So let's get into the formal relation between the U.S. and Brazil. It's a couple of centuries long. We don't need to go through like all parts of it. Let's start with this. What are the major interests of the United States and Brazil?
Sure. If I may, I just want to nuance a little bit there, right? This idea of U.S. tropical, because I know some colleagues are going to push back on that.
Please.
In the sense that, of course, there were moments and some specific, political cultural elites that wanted to make the kind of a tropical version of Paris, right? A tropical French version. That actually goes back all the way into after independence and all the way into kind of what some people even have phrased it in history books, like a tropical Belle Epoque, right? In the early 1900s, Brazil, urban reforms emulated Paris. So there's always this foreign influence that goes beyond the United States, but especially in the sort of American century, right? The 20th century, and especially after World War II, as the United States becomes the political, cultural, economic, hegemon in the world, but especially in Latin America, that certainly has become the more concrete, more direct, more for better or worse, influence in Brazilian society, in Brazilian culture, in Brazilian politics, in Brazilian economic projects. And then getting back to your question. So, I think from the beginning, Brazil, there's this saying in U.S.-Brazil relations. Sometimes people, question a little bit of that, but nonetheless, if not the first, the United States was at least one of the first countries to recognize Brazil's independence, which happened in 1822, right? Again, 1822 is kind of this 1976, right, of the United States, when they declare the push for independence. Not necessarily.
You mean 1776, not 1976?
Sorry, 1776. Yeah. Absolutely. In the sense that they declared the push for independence, not exactly when they necessarily achieved it, right? Yeah. So that was September 7, 1822. Formal recognition happened a few years later. And England, from recognition from Portugal, saying like, yes, okay, you guys are independent now. Similar things that happened to Spanish possessions, Spanish colonies in the New World as well. Britain played a major role in that process. But because, again, Britain, which was a very influential country in the United States, in Brazil throughout the 19th century, but because, again, history is always being re-examined, right? Mm-hmm. Because we look at from today's perspective, and again, having had the American century, the 20th century in between that, right? It makes much more in U.S.-Brazil relations to go back to say, hey, the United States government was one of the first to recognize Brazil's independence, which of course is an expression of goodwill between the countries, is an expression of mutual interest. And, of course. And I would agree with that. That's very much true. There was this sense, maybe if this helps, I would say, the sense that from Brazilian elites as well as from American elites that between the New World, where most nations are actually former Spanish possessions, right? Most countries in the New World speak Spanish as at least one of their official languages, right? And you guys are a little different, right? You are Iberian, but you actually speak a little bit of a different language. You know, it's Portuguese. You went through a little bit of a different path, and so did we, right? Did we in the United States? So in a sense, there's like Anglo America, there's a Spanish American, maybe there's this Luso America, right? This other, you know, different country there. There's also this growing sense that, hey, Brazil is a little, you know, distant enough that it's not really a border possession, right? Mexico, which of course would take a brunt of this, you know, proximity with the United States, for better or worse. We in a different podcast. So Brazil is distant enough, right, that we acknowledge your uniqueness, right, your cultural, historical difference vis-a-vis the Spanish-speaking countries. We are not so sure about your monarchical regime. Brazil is the only country that after independence in the New World has had decades long a monarchical regime, right?
Yeah.
Most of the 19th century Brazil was ruled by two emperors, right? Two Brazilian emperors who were actually heirs of the Portuguese, you know, dynastic family, monarchical family, which is a very unique trait of Brazilian political history. That
also the only South American country in which a European monarch actually came in, the Portuguese emperor,
1808, you know, amidst Napoleonic adventures, right? In Europe, the Portuguese royal court moved to Rio. And then they returned to Portugal only in 1820. You know, they lived for about 12 years in Brazil, which played a major role in the path of independence of Brazil, which was a much more negotiated and moderate course of independence vis-a-vis the U.S., vis-a-vis much of Spanish America. So there was that recognition that Brazil is a little bit unique. We're not so sure about this monarchical regime, but maybe we can work with you guys. And you have the legitimacy of being an European ruling family. You are, in a sense, a little more civilized, and you are a little more stable than this unruliness that, you know, tragically shaped much of political history in many former Spanish colonies. So maybe we can work with you guys. There was a little bit of a sense of huge potential, mutual respect, with a little bit of mistrust somewhat of the monarchical regime. Of course, the United States coming out of a Republican project, right? In its independence. There were other features that are not unique about U.S.-Brazil relations, I would say, also were elements of U.S.-Latin American relations. There was a little bit of a sense of, we're not so sure not only about your monarchical, you know, element, which is unique to Brazil, but your Catholicism, your mixed race, excessive mixed race in your populations, your sort of patrimonial political culture, political traditions. But nonetheless, all of that said, right, there was a sense of recognition of your huge potential, also a large country with a large population, a huge, you know, promising market, tremendous resources that we could have trade with you. And indeed, you know, some of it start happening. Again, if you go back 200 years ago, you know, distances matter more, you know, all those things. So proximity always matter in this relation with the United States, Latin America as well. That will change, I would say, in the course of the 20th century somewhat. But that distance, in a way, was beneficial to Brazil because there was interest, but not necessarily the level of intervention as maybe, you know, not maybe, that certainly the Caribbean nations, the Central American nations, and Mexico suffered already in the 19th century. So there was a bit of that. And then just move a little bit into the early 20th century.
If I may just interrupt you for one moment, Dr. Otis, you said interest, but not intervention. Just a small question. Did Brazil fall within the orbit of the Monroe Doctrine? You said they declared independence in 1822, and the Monroe Doctrine also came, I think, in the 1820s, if not the late 18 teens. So that's a yes.
1824, yeah.
No. Did Brazil fall within the orbit of America?
Exactly. Yes, because the Monroe Doctrine was a projection, right? A hemispheric projection of the United States, right? It was a statement more targeted, and it kind of makes sense because the United States ruling elites were really speaking to who they saw as co-equals, which meant European elites.
Exactly.
They were addressing the European elites more so than Latin American elites, interestingly, right? And hey, this is our hemisphere, right? We are the ones, the caretakers of the hemisphere. So, of course, Brazil fell into that orbit too. But there are some different elements of that in Brazil, in the sense, again, I think geography matters a lot here. The sense that, yes, of course, you fall under that orbit, but we don't see you as the immediate region of more direct interest, right? Again, anywhere too distant.
I see.
And we kind of acknowledge our potential, including the potential to be maybe a stabilizing force in South America.
Huh.
Which has been an element, right, long-term element, you would say, geopolitical element of U.S.-Brazilian relations, and I can come back to it in a bit. But so the more, sure, it did fall under the Monroe Doctrine, but we need to kind of remember a little bit the Monroe Doctrine in the beginning, for different reasons, was primarily addressing European audiences, but also the potential for the United States to actually be as interventionistic, right? Interventionist as it became later, right? We tend to think about the Monroe Doctrine, knowing what happened, with the invasion of Mexico, knowing what happened in 1898 with the war with Cuba, or against Spain about Cuba, with the interventionism, many military incursions of the Marines in Central America in the early 20th century. And we know about the Cold War role of the United States government in Latin America. So it's like, oh, it's all fulfillment of the Monroe Doctrine. To some extent, yes, but the Monroe Doctrine evolved, right? The Monroe Doctrine assumed much more new elements of this self-professed, righteousness, right? Duty to intervene. At that time, was much more a statement of a hemispheric, unique realm in the world. And why am I saying all this? Because some groups not only in Brazil, but certainly in Brazil, saw that, not necessarily, again, it's hard to generalize, depends on different groups and different political, elites and cultural elites, but some people saw that actually as a statement that they could go along with. They said, yes, we acknowledge the uniqueness of the Western Hemisphere. And if you're going to help us to maintain that uniqueness, these are countries coming out, right? Some countries were not even independent in 1824, right? This was the end of independence in Latin America. Brazil had just now, achieved independence just a couple of years before. I mean, not even achieved.
They declared it.
They declared the goal of independence, right? Yeah. So they sort of said, like, yes, help us not be recolonized by Europeans, right? So there was a little bit of, not sympathy, but a sense that, hey, yeah, we acknowledge you started before, you are much more powerful than we are at the moment, at least, right? We are amidst, independence war, some regions were still. So yeah, we don't have major issues, as later would certainly be the case when the United States Monroe Doctrine was justified to really intervene more directly into specific territories and to take decisions and positions about different groups in elections or governments and all the many things that unfolded. So there's a little bit of that. And that was important and I just want to come back a little bit to what Brazilian elites were doing early in the 20th century, because I think that's an important, sort of point. There's this very important foreign minister in Brazil in the early 20th century, which is called Rio Branco. His last name is Rio Branco. And that's the name of the Institute of Diplomacy that trains diplomats in Brazil, and that gives the
wow.
weight how important this foreign minister was. He was a long-lasting foreign minister over different administrations, given the stature and the influence that he had in Brazilian politics and diplomacy. And he was the one that understood very well in the beginning. This is a foreign minister in 1902, 1905, right? When the United States was emerging more into the global, arena after the war against Spain over Cuba, taking over the Philippines, and all of those things. This phase of rise of United States imperialism. He understood very well. The United States is becoming, and it's due to become, the most important nation and the most important economic force in the world in the 20th century. There was a lot of foresight there. Brazil, the U.S. market was already the most important market for Brazil's most important export item. And of course, we know that was, and to some extent still is, coffee, right? Coffee, which is known as the black gold of Brazil, right? It was given the importance of coffee exports. So Rio Branco switched. He didn't do that at the cost of cutting relations of key European countries, primarily Britain, where he had served as ambassador, France, who continued to have very good relations with Brazil. But he flipped. Right? No longer London embassy was the most important embassy for Brazil in the world. It was Washington's embassy, right? It became this push to actually deepen relations with the United States. And why am I highlighting all this? Because at that time, Brazilian elites saw the rise of the United States not as much as a threat, right? At their own risk, I would say, right? Not as much as a threat as some other countries in Latin America perceived at the time. Rather, they saw that as a fait accompli, right? I mean, that's the inevitable course of things. So we might as well have good relations with them. And again, given that they have had, very good relations, not, very crucial, not very close, again, distance matter, right? With the United States for the preceding decades, the United States acknowledged the stability that the monarchy provided. Brazil had by then become a republic. 1889 is the fall of the monarchy and the rise of the Republican regime in Brazil. The United States government actually abetted the consolidation of the new regime in Brazil, because now, right, everything else that Brazil had, huge market, huge potential, a supplier of coffee, a stable regime, while many Spanish-speaking countries in the 19th century had civil wars for a long time. But now it became a republic, so everything is good now, right? The stain which was being a monarchy, right, is addressed.
One of the three main issues, monarchy, Catholicism, and mixed race. One of them was monarchy, and that's gone.
Exactly. So there because and that was interesting. 89, the regime fell in a coup. I mean, in Brazilian textbooks, we call about the Declaration of the Republic. A very nationalistic reading of things. It was a military coup that deposed the emperor, right, and implemented a republican regime. And some groups, so important economic, political groups, a couple of years later, tried to do a counter coup, and to actually go against the royalists that wanted to take back. Royalists. They didn't really have a very specific agenda, but they wanted to go, kind of reverse things back to the old stability of the monarch. By that time, the Brazilian former emperor Peter II was in France in exile, and so it would be very, very hard to actually reverse things. But they were against the established regime, but they didn't succeed. One of the reasons they didn't succeed is because U.S. Navy ships based in Rio went against some of the Navy ships of the Brazilian Navy that they had taken over to bombard Rio, which was the capital city of the country.
Oh, wow.
So the United States government played an important role defending the Republican regime in Brazil. Now, we can be as cynical as we want in that, to say that, hey, the United States did that in a self-interested way because the new regime promised to have even better economic relations and trade relations with the United States. And I would say there's nothing wrong with in your own interest, but what matters is if it could be a little more win-win, right? It could be a little more reciprocal gains, right? That's kind of the thing that I think is, and if I could make one more general statement, one of the features of U.S.-Brazil relations in a general sense, there's this huge potential for closer relations, better understanding, and I would say even more closer, but also more reciprocally constructive relations. But unfortunately, that not had always been the case, right? And we can maybe detail that a little more in different moments of history.
So in 1889, Brazil becomes a republic, and U.S. Navy ships help fend off a potential coup, sort of, which is kudos for Americans. I mean, to help Brazil's republic. Then, starting in the early 1900s, 1902, going on, a famous and long-serving foreign minister of Brazil recognizes that it's inevitable, fait accompli, that the U.S. will be the economic and military hegemon of the world, certainly the Western Hemisphere, and starts to treat D.C. with much more import than London. We got that. Throughout the 20th century and up to now, and without going into a 6-hour podcast, what are some of the moments that we got closer and some of the moments that we got more distant?
Sure. So the New Deal is an important turning point in U.S.-Brazil relations.
So 1930s.
1930s, yes. For different reasons. First, I think for the last sort of 30 years, right, until the New Deal starts, 34, 35, United States, on the one hand, investment capital, but also military interventions and so forth, was much more present in Mexico for sure, and Central America, in the Caribbean. It started a little bit more like Venezuela. There's an United States intervention in the early 1900s. But Brazil, again, it had a very good relation. I would say cordial, right? Friendly, cordial, but not very intense. we could argue for better or worse, right? That was the case, but so the United States was the most important foreign market for Brazil's exports. So very economically already, the most important one. At that time, first quarter of the 20th century, the French cultural, diplomatic, artistic influence was still very high in Brazilian, elites, among Brazilian elites, and so was Britain, political ideologies, economic ideologies, all of that. But again, the United States was already certainly the established, most important economic partner.
You said French and British. You didn't say Portuguese.
No. No.
Interesting. Okay.
To a greater extent, I would say if indeed we could speak of three Americas, right? Anglo, Spanish, and Luso, right? The Portuguese. I would say first United States, and then Spain, and then only finally then Brazil are the countries that, as independent nation states now, kind of have a rapprochement with their former colonial, power. It takes much longer, to kind of acknowledge. And
oh wow, interesting. Okay, so let's continue with.
I think the
New Deal.
The New Deal is a turning point. The New Deal is a turning point for different reasons. First, because the New Deal, right, is also a moment when Roosevelt, FDR, establishes the good neighbor policy, which was something that Latin American elites, ruling political, diplomatic, legal elites have demanded for a long time. As the United States become much more of an imperial force, especially in the Western Hemisphere in already late 1800s and early 1900s, these legal scholars or diplomats and governments in Brazil, in Latin America, were demanding better relations. Respect us, our sovereignty. Respect us, established nation states. We don't want to go against you, and we acknowledge we can't go against you directly, and we don't want you to not be interested in us. We rather want you to have huge interest in us, but positive ones. Again, constructive relations with us. And a cornerstone so that can be done is non-intervention, right?
Non-intervention, okay.
Yeah, sovereignty. So actually now we have interesting scholarship detailing this is a much higher degree than maybe even 10, 20 years ago, indicating that it was, to a large extent, legal scholars from countries, one of them being very important, one Argentina, but also beyond that, Chile, Mexico, Brazil, demanding and highlighting the value of non-intervention and sovereignty, right, in international law already in the early 1900s. And those things are going to become very important into inter-American system already in the New Deal, in the Good Neighbor policy in the 1930s. But even beyond, they're going to become cornerstone notions of the United Nations systems. So this new scholarship is really tracing the trajectory of legal demands, legal formulations, very sophisticated ones, by Latin American legal thinkers, right? That would create notions in international law that later are going to be taken to be important for international public law in the world, right?
This all sounds positive.
I would say so. Yes.
Yeah.
I agree. And so that's why it's important, the New Deal, because with the good neighbor policy, right, there's this sense, that's one of the cornerstone elements of the good neighbor policy, right? We're not going to intervene anymore. And with the exception of one small intervention, well, not small if you ask the Cubans, but there's a ruling regime in Cuba that the United States government helps to undo, right?
Yeah.
Democratic regime in Cuba, he helps to undo because it wasn't seen as favorable in DC. But that's an exceptional case. With the majority of countries, the United States has a much more cordial, non-interventionist policies, and an important element of the good neighbor policy, and Brazil is a key country there, much higher levels of better terms of trade. And that's a very important demand also from Latin American, not only jurists, right, or legal scholars or diplomats, but also economic elites, right? We want to have trade with you, but on better terms, right? So the good neighbor is an important moment there. Also, it helped, and Brazil is important there because, again, the largest economy already in Latin America is becoming the largest economy in Latin America by then. The colony of Brazil was not the richest or more most populous or more sort of developed, if we want to use anachronistic, terminology, in colonial, right, in the beginning of the New World, European presence. Mexico's a much wealthier colony, right, for Spain and in the world for all the way into the early 1700s and so forth. But Brazil has a tremendous catching up in the 19th century, early 20th century, and throughout the 20th century, which makes Brazil today be the largest economy in the region, right? So there's a lot of catching up that happens now. And it happens now in the 1930s. Also, Brazil has a political leader who comes to power also in a military, questionable, intervention, brings him to power. But interestingly, even though it was a, military, illegal intervention in politics, He was a strong nationalist leader. That again, it's one of the key actors of Brazilian history, political history, because it's a very controversial figure. Because he had, of course, questionable elements such as being an authoritarian leader in the late 1930s as a dictator in Brazil, but he promoted a lot of what we could, in a sort of a sense, progressive economic or innovative economic policies, primarily industrialization. Right, and the United States played a major role there. Here was a guy, his name was Vargas, Getúlio Vargas, kind of quintessential political leader of the 20th century and developmental economic history in Brazil. He had very good relations with FDR. They understood that both countries needed a new deal. They needed to reframe their political system. They needed to restructure their economies, primarily by having the government, the federal government in both countries, they're both federative republics, right? Federations of states. Brazil has always been that case once it became a republic in 1889, right? When the fall of the monarchy. And to this day, it's the Federation of States, very similar governors like in the United States. The Constitution has, many things are similar to the U.S. Constitution. The first Constitution of Brazil, and I say first because Brazil has had many constitutions, not like the United States. The first
You don't mean amendments, these are new constitutions.
New constitutions, entirely new constitutions, yeah. Okay. And sometimes they maintain different elements, right? But the first one, which is 1891, is very much a copy of the U.S. Constitution, right? And even the official name of the country was the United States of Brazil. There you go, right? So it highlights to you, a lot of this idea of, hey, now as a republic, we can certainly, be more equipped to become again, I'm going to use the same expression, the version of the United States in the tropics or the version of the United States in South America. Yeah. Again, I want to make one more nuance there in the sense that Brazil never aspired to be a military powerhouse, geopolitical aspirations to intervene in neighboring countries like the United States has done and has become, right? So when I mean the United States of South America is as a sort of a wealthy, prosperous, powerful country, yeah, and a country that's respected abroad as well. In that sense, those would be the sort of the main aspirations of Brazilian elites. So in the 1930s, an important turning point there. And this pace of fast industrialization that starts unfolding in Brazil in the late 30s really deepens throughout World War II, again, with the help of FDR in the United States. To give one concrete example, the first steel mill, right, to produce steel in Brazil, in Latin America, was the one that was created in Brazil in 1942 with capital and finance from the United States government. So the United States helped. It played a major role, government and private actors, companies, in the path of industrialization of Brazil. The industrialization of Brazil later would absorb other sources of capital and technology, such as from Germany, Japan primarily. But essentially, the industrialization of Brazil, which really picked up pace from the 30s to the 70s, to make it the most important industrial base in Latin America, but by the 1970s in the global South. Right? Brazil became the most important industrial base in the global South by the 1970s. And much of that over, a course of 30, 40 years happened with support, not linear, there are issues there, right? But support from government, but also capital and technology from the United States. So that brought together even more those two countries. But what were some of the frictions in that? Yeah. When that was unfolding.
If I may just interrupt you, I just want to clarify something, Dr. Iotis. This is a small point. We don't need to spend time on it. The military, the authoritarian military regime that started in the 1930s, I know the answer to this. I just want to clarify it. Had no relation with fascism and any of that was happening in Europe. Hence, that's why FDR had good relations with him and helped Brazil develop. You're shaking your head. You're bobbing your head. By the way, do you and I still have time, right?
Yes, I'm fine.
Okay,
yes.
Go ahead. So go ahead.
Yes and no. I would say
yes and no.
The yes is strong. Yeah, the yes is stronger than the no because yes, primarily you are correct. But there were sectors in this political, similar to the New Deal. There's a new broad political coalition that comes to power, right? It's not just one single group. There are different people, more progressive, more conservatives, more more liberal, more sort of, fascist groups that come to power. And it had to be a broad coalition to be able to really reframe the course of development in Brazil from the 1930s, into the 40s. So this regime falls in 45. With the end of World War II and the death of FDR, a lot of things, a lot of changes will happen in the United States, will happen in Brazil, and will happen in U.S.-Brazil relations, right? But there were elements of look, we have to go back to the mid-1930s. Germany was a very appealing country for many countries in the world, including appealing, I would say, to some segments of U.S. Political economic elites, right? It was this fast-paced transformations that this strong regime was being able to provide. Of course, we didn't know, let's say, 34, 35, what would happen later, in detail.
Exactly. But images of their Autobahn and their industrial development and all of that looked good from the outside.
Reduce inflation, reduce unemployment, all those things. So there were segments in Brazilian society, political, economic, cultural elites, ethnic groups, German descendants in Brazil, that were very much appealed by that. So that was, I think, was the really wise thing that FDR did. And the Brazilian president, who was pressured from a lot of special people in the military to not take a side everybody knew by 36, 37 that a war would happen. They didn't know the details of what that war would become, right? The scale of it, but it was kind of a sense that, kind of a doom, inevitable, course of things. And there were pressures that among the armed forces in Brazil to not take a side or even to align with Germany, right? Germany provided better terms of trade with Brazil by the mid-30s than the United States was providing at that time. And that's when FDR, yes, because it did not have to go through, it was a kind of a barter system, right? It would say, hey, we get your coffee and we give you weapons, right? We don't have to go through currency. At that time, it was mostly British pound, but some of the dollars already. So that takes always a lot of more, bureaucracy, and you always lose something in those transactions. By the way, that is a very current conversation happening in the global south in Brazil at the moment, right? What to do with the weight of the dollar in the world.
Exactly, to diminish the power of the dollar.
Later. But so and FDR was really wise in seeing this and mobilizing a lot of resources, to attract and to maintain Brazil allied with the United States in the war. Brazil is the main country, essentially Mexico provided some air force, support, but Brazil provided troops in Europe. It's the only country, the main country in Latin America that actually provided troops, from Brazil under U.S. leadership in Italy, against the Nazi forces and helping, move them out from the south all the way to the north. So Brazilian was a allied country, right, in the World War II effort. There were even conversations that Brazil maybe, there was a little bit of a promise, there's a little bit of a debate about that, but at least in the eyes of Brazilian political economic elites, that Brazil, because of it, had supported so much the United States in the ally effort in World War II, and it was now speaking for the region, that it maybe should have a seat at the United Nations Security Council. Yes, yeah, I know. It's seen as that we were essential in this war effort and given everything we provided, because the other side of that is not just troops. Brazil provided a lot of natural resources, including rubber, right? How can you have tanks, jeeps without rubber, right?
Exactly.
And the rubber, by then, it was starting to be produced in Malaysia, but primarily was still coming from the Amazon. And the United States government provided a lot of money to enhance the extraction of rubber in the Amazon, money to pay people to go there, but also in programs for health, sanitation to address the issue of malaria in the Amazon. A lot of educational, academic, scientific missions from the United States. Sometimes public money, sometimes like the Rockefeller Foundation money, supporting kind of this closer presence of United States actors, private, public, scientific, academic, political, economic, presence. So World War II was also another chapter of enhancement of bringing even closer, right, Brazil in the United States. And that has become a kind of an important feature of what comes next, with growing frictions and frustrations, especially on the Brazil side. And I will try to be very, very, to the point here, because I know the time is of the essence here. Which is, I'm fine, keep going, but I don't want to also, take too long.
No, I appreciate it. I think focuses would be great. Go
because
ahead, please.
When the Cold War starts, so after World War II, when the Cold War starts, right, late 40s, the U.S. Ruling elites, Truman and then Eisenhower and everything else, they again, and I get it from the perspective of the United States leaders. We are now the world superpower, right? We have a lot of places to take care of, or right, of problems to address, in Europe, in Asia, Southeast Asia. The Korean War was about to eclode, and so forth and so on. And Latin America, it's kind of taken for granted, to be honest, right? It's a secure region now. The Nazi incursion in Latin America is taken care. You guys were primarily an ally region. And so, we have bigger things to take care of. And that led to a huge sense of frustration among Brazilian, but also more broadly Latin American elites, because they felt a little bit like betrayed. Like, hey, we were so supportive of you. We share so much of your liberal values. I mean, in terms of regions of the world, Latin America is one of the key regions in the world as signatories of the United Nations Charter. Just because there were many Latin American countries already, think of Africa is still under colonial rule, Asia, right? At least it's 44, even prior to India's independence, right? So Latin America as a region has many, many signatories, right, of the United Nations Charter. So they felt like, hey, we were again on board with this, and now you're telling us, wait, right? This is the moment when we wanted to deepen, to continue, and Brazilian elites were primary, kind of the ones, voicing these demands with the United States government already in the 40s, but throughout the 50s and so forth. We wanted to be taken more seriously, and this is the time when you actually should stay engaged with us. The good neighbor policy was so positive, not only for us, but also for you. We helped the reconstruction of the United States economy. We help, again, the war effort. So stay connected and engaged with the region. And of course, the United States government was much more engaged in elsewhere, other parts of the world. So that frustration will be a new element, especially U.S.-Brazil relations in the Cold War, with different moments of that. Not at the cost of cutting relations. Rather, actually, a moment of Brazilian history that I study in detail in one of my books. One of the key presidents of Brazil, Vargas, comes back in the early 50s. And even though, to some extent, he is seen as anti-U.S., that's a very short-sighted view of what he was trying to do in the 1950s. He knew he wasn't dealing with FDR anymore, but he tried to come back to have good constructive relations with the United States government. But because the United States government was much more restricted about public funds and public technology, or public support from governmental support for public in Brazilian terminology means actually governmental, which is an interesting difference in political culture. Right? Public is usually considered to be the state rather than here, which is, of course, society abroad. Right?
Exactly, yeah.
So it's federal funds or federal engagement. And Truman provides some of that. There's an investigative commission to try to expedite, to deepen the Brazilian developmental path in the early 50s, provided by United States money approved by Truman. But when Eisenhower comes, he cuts that. And that creates a growing sense of frustration. Vargas, actually, he commits suicide in 54, but we don't have time for that. But the new president, right, which is kind of an heir of Vargas' developmental plans, and he's the one key guy that really deepens industrialization with private capital, not anymore with the steel mills, provided by the United States capital and technology, but by multinational corporations coming to Brazil to produce one of the key things, cars, automobiles, right? The sense of, to become an industrial country, you need to have cars, to produce cars, right? But not by developing its own technology, but by inviting GM, Ford, Chrysler, Alfa Romeo, Renault, Volkswagen to come produce in Brazil. But he did all that, first of all, by appealing to Eisenhower, asking him to create what he proposed to be Operation Pan America. Right? It really sounds like a hemispheric effort, right? And what it was, right? He said, look, Latin America is in desperate need to expedite its development. Right? We are one of the regions of the world with the highest per capita growth, right? And now that most countries are under democratic rule, which is in some countries a very new thing, right? There's growing pressures on us as leaders to give answers to this rising social demands, for development, for prosperity, for growth, for jobs. Help us in doing this. We acknowledge your huge leadership, potential, wealth, prosperity, technology, all of the above. Again, we want to be more like you, but you need to be engaged with us in that effort. Eisenhower is not very, very warm to that idea, but interestingly, if you look at the first page of the Alliance for Progress, right, Kennedy's main initiative towards Latin America in 1961, The first page acknowledges we are creating this Alliance for Progress on the basis and inspired by Kubitschek's, that's the Brazilian president, projects of Operation Pan America.
Huh.
Yes, there's an acknowledgement of that, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that we are now sort of delivering, right, on the demands and the hopes of Latin America. Now, I want to move forward.
Yeah.
As you know, Alliance for Progress is not a great success, at least not a great success in the perspective of Latin America, right? There's a lot of promise, a lot of expectation that the sort of would be the Marshall Plan for the region, that we would overcome our developmental or underdevelopmental challenges and issues. And there's a huge sense of frustration. And now this is after the Cuban Revolution, and which most scholars now, highlight as at least one, if not the main inspiration for Alliance for Progress, by the way, right? It's not well implemented, or it didn't answer the real needs, and now the Cold War really hits hard Latin America in the 1960s. Until then, it was primarily an experience, right, happening more in Europe, Eastern Europe, Berlin, Korea, right, Malaysia, other places in Greece. Latin America was a little bit at bay in that sense, with the exception of an intervention of the United States government, Eisenhower administration in '54 in Guatemala. But after the Cuban Revolution, Latin American societies, Brazil was becoming much more divided, much more polarized ideologically. There's a sort of a domestic Cold War, in those nations as well, and very much so in Brazil. And so that sense of the Cold War hitting at home, led to a lot of more polarization and divide and a sense of urgency, right? If we don't do something, the left's going to take over. If we don't do something, the right's going to take over, all that kind of sense. That leads us, and which is a very important new chapter in U.S.-Brazil relations, which is a military coup in 1964. And that puts into the country a long-lasting 21 years old, or, you could even go beyond that, a long dictatorship. It's a very repressive regime. It's a right-wing, reactionary, conservative military regime, or new regime in power, which was supported by the United States government. President Johnson supports the coup, approves the coup, condones the coup. Doesn't do it directly as with money or weapons, as he did in some other United States interventions in Latin America in the Cold War. But nonetheless, it was a supportive government for that regime. Interesting, that regime, which again, 21 years is a long time, right? It went through different phases. In the beginning, it tried to really have even more, closer relationship with the United States government. Again, it's just a regime that came to power March '64 with a lot of support from the United States government, and it really created new laws that opened the market for United States capital and investment. So really favor a lot of U.S. interest in Brazil at that time. But by the 1970s, the regime, which is the same regime, but it went through different leaders. It was not like Pinochet, one guy. It was actually 5 different generals in power for over 21 years. By the 1970s, there's an acknowledgement that, hey, we're not going to be able to provide our agenda of development, fast-paced, development for the country, because they acknowledge Brazil is too big, it's too complicated, it's too unequal, it's too underdeveloped. And we need to expedite this process, even us, right, as a allied, right-wing regime against the sort of more progressive reformist path of fast-paced development that Vargas and Kubitschek tried to do in the 30s, 40s, 50s. But even we have to acknowledge that we have to expedite this. And private capital from the United States is not going to be enough. So we need to bring
It's not going to be enough.
Not going to be enough. Which was kind of the key cornerstone, right, of United States foreign policy for in the Cold War. When Vargas said, hey, let's go back to the good neighbor policy, provide us, public funds. It doesn't have to be from the Import-Export Bank only, or land lease grants only. It could be from the World Bank. But what they would get back from the United States governments, Truman, Eisenhower, and even later Nixon will bring that back very forcefully, with the exception of the Alliance for Progress, is no, you need to, again, the traditional argument, right? Open your markets for private capital. Private capital is going to be your path to development. And the military, even again, a aligned regime, and right-wing regime, very repressive to its own population against the left, against progressive groups in Brazil, torture, disappearance of people, and all of those things that happened in many countries in Latin America in the 1970s. They would bring back the federal government, right, to have a bigger role in that relation. And the United States government gets a little puzzled by that. So like, hey, we supported your coup, we supported your regime. You're supposed to follow the kind of the private, capital approach to things, and now you're bringing back a lot of public investment, and relations are not going to be so smooth anymore. To the point that by the late 1970s, there's an intervening variable there, which is the Carter administration, who brings back a little bit of human rights to the relations with the United States and Latin America, right? And that regime is not happy with that pressure from the Carter administration, but also because of this growing sense of misunderstanding. Once again, one new chapter of misunderstanding or lack of understanding of where the other side was coming from, that they would lead to actually very a strong chapter of friction between the United States and Brazil governments at that point. Now,
which is interesting because about that time in the 70s or late 70s, even Europeans start have some socialism going on. They have big government investment in some of their own projects because private capital is just not doing it. So that's really interesting that the U.S. takes this sort of view, this sort of approach towards Brazil.
It's one of the key things in my first meeting when I teach about Cold War in Latin America to my students. I say, look, a lot of policies that were supported by the United States, not only in Western Europe, but very much in Western Europe, like social democracy, welfare, but also in Japan, even in South Korea, right, were really not approved and condoned in Latin America primarily by their own elites, Latin American elites, but also by the United States government.
That's interesting.
There's all the elements of this sort of misunderstanding of where people are coming from. So the country redemocratizes in the 1980s, which brings to a new chapter of U.S.-Brazil relations, right? The United States actually is supportive of that path of redemocratization, as it was supportive in other countries in the region as well. The 1980s is a very complicated decade for many countries in the region, and very much so in Brazil. Hyperinflation, the debt crisis, and all those things, which in a sense will force the Brazilian government a little more under this fear, really needed much more help of the United States government to overcome, the debt crisis primarily, had to negotiate with a lot of, U.S. banks. And so, and the United States government as a co-signer of some of the new loans needed to restructure their debts. So it brings back again a lot of more proximity in terms of economic policies, and that leads all the way to the 1990s, kind of the economic policies that Brazilian leaders were pushing to the countries with the approval and support from the United States government. That doesn't mean that they were always on the same page, but they're very happy about each other. They were forced to kind of cooperate and work together. But that's also a moment, and again, let's go back to the beginning, a kind of pop culture, right? Again, under the dictatorship, especially groups on the left and youth groups and 68 here, 68 in other parts of the world, right? Students on the streets. There was a little bit of that anti-U.S. perspective, right? Ironically, even though they listened to rock and roll and they had long hippie hair and all those kind of things, right? They didn't like the Yankee imperialism, right? So that was an important element of the left narrative about the United States. But now we are a democracy again, so we're not as polarized as then or as now, and so we are okay with just everybody watching again the Hollywood movies and drinking Coca-Cola and everything else. So it's kind of a rapprochement that I would say is an important element of what had been already an important element of U.S.-Brazilian relations in a more societal sense, right? But it's still an element there today.
So you said as then or as now, and let's take us to now. President Trump has imposed tariffs on Brazil, and much of it has to do with the prosecution, the legal process against former President Jair Bolsonaro. So, one, is this perceived in Brazil as an interference with Brazilian domestic legal issues? And if so, how does the Brazilian government feel about it? How is this impacting the relations? How do the people there feel about it?
Sure. So let me provide some context, right? With the rise, global rise in a sense, right, of the extreme right, right, in the last decade or so, there are a lot of leaders that we could put in that list, in addition to President Trump, in a sense, and many candidates, would be there. Some obvious candidates like Orban in Hungary and so forth. But I would say, I would propose here that probably the closest actual, example of a leader that is very aligned, tried to pursue very similar things, such as from the sort of edgy issues that he highlighted in his own political career and agenda and platform, and then in power, the way he managed the country or mismanaged the country, would be Jair Bolsonaro. Right, very much so, and he was even called the Trump of the tropics, right? To just give a
Above the tropics
by Western media, and then he really loved that idea, and Trump even sort of liked that idea too. So, and they even have family connections, and honestly, I think Bolsonaro is much more interested and knowledgeable about Trump than vice versa, right?
Yeah.
Again, it goes back to kind of that idea. We know much more about you than you know about us.
Exactly. Yeah.
But still, right? Of course, President Trump knows very well who Bolsonaro is. His son, who's is a member of the Chamber of Representatives in Brazil, has been in the United States, lives in the United States, lives in Orlando since February, to kind of advocate for his father in the Trump administration. And to some extent, the new tariffs that the U.S. government has imposed on Brazil, one of the highest in the world, has a lot to do with that lobbying effort by Eduardo Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro's son, one of the sons, who is a kind of a very articulate right-wing, ideologue, and made this case to Bannon and others in the administration that his father is prosecutor in Brazil now, even though it indeed is a functioning democracy, is not. It should be seen as a dictatorship, as an arbitrary regime that the laws of Brazil are promoting. The Supreme Court in Brazil is promoting a witch hunt against Bolsonaro, none of which actually has any evidence, or any basis for to be made. But nonetheless, that's the narrative. So that's one element. The other thing I need to contextualize is Brazil, again, in the last 10, 15 years, and still now, even though Lula managed to come back to power and so forth in 2022, even though Brazilian society continues to be very politically and ideologically divided, sort of similar, again, to what it would be the case of the United States in the last several years. So all of that to say that, first of all, the decision by the Trump administration to impose these new tariffs on Brazil have no basis on reality, right? It argues that there's a witch hunt against Bolsonaro. There's no basis for that of any kind, and that there's a deficit, right, in trade between the United States and Brazil, which is also not true. For the last, I believe, since 2008 or 9, actually, the United States has a surplus, right, in trade with Brazil. So none of which is stated in the first letter that the Trump administration sent to Brazil, to Lula's government, are saying that we will impose these tariffs is because there's a witch hunt against Bolsonaro and because there's a deficit with you are true. So it is indeed a politically motivated decision, right? I mean, it's very clear by any sort of observer that looks at the facts. But how is that seen in Brazil? Which is exactly right. It's seen in Brazil depending on who you ask, because Bolsonaro still runs with about maybe 30-40% of support, approval, and maybe not him anymore. Or his family or the last name Bolsonaro, but of his movement, right? His right wing or the extreme right wing in Brazil. They're very, very powerful among different parties and different sections of society, evangelical groups, economic elites, agribusiness, strong capital groups in banks, in the media. So there's a lot of that appeal to that narrative. So they sometimes they even like what has been done because they think it's a necessary measure to remove Lula from power, a dictator.
Yeah.
The majority maybe are not.
Well, they say he's a dictator, not that he's a dictator.
No, yes, of course. They say, right, to be removed from power. That, in a sense, there are demonstrations in Brazil where they have the U.S. flag and they say, "Mr. Trump, come, save us from this arbitrary regime, and we count on you, and we pray, that you would come and so forth." Kind of a chevalier, coming to save us, from this situation.
When you say mass demonstrations, is this like hundreds of thousands? Is this a big deal?
Well, throughout the country, yes. Different places, maybe dozens of thousands. They have done that even more recently, a couple of weeks ago. So there's all of that to say that there's a strong support for that. But I would say even more, and even larger numbers of people say that, what Trump is doing is a sort of a bitter pill, but it's necessary, and Lula's at fault. It's what Lula is doing, is what the Supreme Court is doing. So just listen to Trump. Just answer to his demands, right? So there's a lot of that sort of side of narrative that a lot of people are supporting too. All of that said,
Wow.
all of that said, there's again a strong, sense of nationalism in Brazil. So, and we have some different numbers on some, surveys recently about this. Over 50%, but it's not maybe 2/3. It's between half and 2/3 of people think the United States is wrong. The United States administration is wrong, that there's no basis for that. That's a politically motivated decision, and that the Lula government is not the one at fault, and that it should negotiate from a position of sovereignty. And that's kind of what Lula has been saying all along, saying, look, we're ready to talk to you about tariffs, but we're not going to do that if to start conversations, President, need to intervene in the Supreme Court to tell the justices how they should, they should throw away the case against Bolsonaro. First of all, that's illegal. That's unconstitutional. That goes against the separation of powers. By the way, a system that you guys invented, right? So
Yeah.
we are being even more U.S.-like than you guys in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Because in the letter, Trump demanded that Trump put a stop to the case against Bolsonaro, which means intervene in the Supreme Court.
Lula put a stop
Yes,
to the case.
Lula would go to there's a specific one justice, which is the main justice leading the trial against Bolsonaro, which is called Alexandre de Moraes, who now has been imposed the Magnitsky Act against him, right? So he cannot use credit cards with the Visa, MasterCard, on it. He cannot use banks, or any transaction with U.S. firms. A lot of legal scholars are saying that that's a misuse of the Magnitsky Act and so forth. But anyway, that's the situation in Brazil now. So in the letter, Trump demanded that Lula intervene in the Supreme Court and tell the justices, and tell this one justice specifically, to throw away the case. Lula has said, I'm not going to do that. We are a sovereign nation. We have separation of power. We have laws. We have a constitution. That's not something I'm going to do. If that's the demand to start negotiations about tariffs, then we are in a stalemate, right? So that's the situation. Of course, that's a moving, situation. Huh? So it's a game still being played. Late July, when actually the tariffs were put in place to be actually started in August 6th, there are a lot of exemptions. There's 780 items that have a lot of exemptions that are not really under that attack. One of them that was assumed that it would be exempt is actually coffee. We go back to coffee, which is a third of the coffee used in the United States market. But nonetheless, it still has 50% tariffs. Again, the people continue to negotiate, but not higher level negotiations, because even though the economic ministry from Brazil and the vice president came to Washington to negotiate with the United States administration, if the demand is, that Lula intervenes in the Supreme Court to start negotiation, then it's really hard to do it. So again, it's a moving situation. There are a lot of different people, different perceptions of people, but overwhelmingly, there's a sense that the United States is the one that is actually on the wrong here. But we don't know what's going to be, the outcome of all this.
Wow, that's interesting. So even within Brazil, the reaction is a little bit mixed, even though more than 50% sort of based on nationalism and what's happening in Brazil do believe that the United States is the one that's pushing this, and the U.S., so to speak, is at fault. And that sort of response is expected in a democracy. A democracy is not a monolith. Not everyone goes along with the same thing. Right. And to that extent, Brazil is a democracy as well. So, Otis, as we close, if you want our audience to remember just one point to remember about U.S.-Brazil relations after everything we've talked about, what would that one point be?
So I'll make one with some points, if I may. I would say so the history of U.S.-Brazil relations, right, over 200 years, has been one of mutual interest, not necessarily at the same level, but one of, defined by mutual interest, mutual acknowledgement of the potential of the, why the other is appealing to you. The sense of huge potential in the relationship, and to some extent some investment from both sides that relationship would flourish. But also it has been a relationship mired in a lot of misunderstanding, miscommunication, lack of understanding on the other side's demands or values or ways of doing things and seeing the world. And in that sense, I would say is a path shaped by missed opportunities, right? Because let's just think this conceptually, right? You could have no relations, you could have very negative relations, and there's a little bit of that, but you could also have good relations, right?
Yeah.
Again, my own personal point here. So a lot of missed opportunities with important moments of closer relations and important relations, that a lot of gains, a lot of things that one acknowledges and see the relevance and the value on the other side, but still a huge potential for more to be done and established. But sadly, it seems that today, as we just spoke, right, we just talked, the situation is that even though, why not, right now, 21st century, two functioning democracies, right, we could still say that, regimes that continue to be interested, though they have different views, ideological views of the world, but it seems to be one more situation moment when we may have more missed opportunities for better, closer relations than we could be the case if better understanding, better communication could be established between the two sides. So
I hope we overcome this issue as well, and it doesn't blow up into sort of a rift between our two nations. Dr. Alvarez, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you.